After years of China's rapid growth and development, the world's second largest economy appears to be slowing down. The government is expecting the lowest rate of economic expansion in more than 2 decades at 7.5%. Some economists are predicting a grim future, saying that the growth could dip to as low as 3% in the coming years. Big banks are sounding the alarm over the slowdown, which is also complicating global recovery efforts. So is China in for a financial collapse, or are the doomsday predictions overblown? RT's business correspondent Katie Pilbeam breaks it down.
China, despite enjoying phenomenal growth over the last 3 decades, is not immune to the overall global slowdown. And as an economy reliant on external investment and demand, the cracks are beginning to show. As it currently stands, the Chinese economy is expected to grow a modest 7.5% by their standards, having enjoyed a nearly 10% average growth for the past 30 years. Now, 7.5% is certainly not a disaster. This figure equates to the whole of Switzerland's economy, one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. So if China's growth was to stay at this rate, the country would be adding the whole of the Swiss economy to its balance sheet every year. But nevertheless, the economy is slowing. So what is being done to get the Chinese economy to accelerate a bit more and avoid this 3% scenario? Well, there have been Chinese whispers that the government is planning to implement a huge spending package to boost the country's growth, splashing out on new railways and infrastructure. The government also intends to dig itself out of debt. Most of the country's risk comes from having high debt and bad loans. Now, if all of this sounds bad, it's nothing compared to the situation in Europe, where the euro area is expected to contract. And over in the US, growth is expected to reach just below 2%. And China's fellow emerging markets are expected to grow 5% this year. The fact remains that while China's 7.5% growth may be ruffling a few feathers, most of Europe can only dream of being able to fly that high.
Let's talk more about China and its place in the global economy with James Corbett, the editor of the Corbett Report website. Sir, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Some economists, as you just heard in the report there, see China's slowdown as a signal of a looming crash. Do you think that those fears are justified?
I think they certainly are, and we've already seen indications of that, of course, last month in the next stage of the credit crunch, which hit in an interesting way and actually led to a cash crunch crisis in some of China's peripheral banks last month. So I think we have to see what's happening now in the context of this credit crisis that's been developing for years now, as much of the Chinese economic growth since at least 2009 has been the direct result of Bank of China liquidity injections into the Chinese economy. So now that we have the Xi Jinping administration coming along and trying to supposedly rebalance the Chinese economy away from fixed investment and more towards household consumption, and basically threatening to close that spigot of liquidity into the markets, we see the Chinese shadow banking economy that's supposedly worth at least $10 trillion at this point is starting to clam up. And this is having some severe effects. And I think we could definitely see even further slowdown in growth in the Chinese economy as a result of this.
Which would likely have international implications, of course. But you're in Japan, and I want to bring in the Japan example here. One prediction is that China could be following the fate of that country, both of them relying on exports and credit-fueled investment for growth. Japan, of course, has been in the doldrums for almost 20 years now. Do you think that China could follow suit?
In a certain sense, yes. Although they're different examples based on different things. The Japanese example was really based on the yen appreciation after the 1985 Plaza Accord that led to basically a release of liquidity that built up the stock and the real estate market in Japan. And what's led as a result of that has been the 20-year deflationary recession here. So that's basically what Japan and what the Abe administration here is trying to do is kind of the opposite of what China's trying to do, which is to actually open the spigots and to actually get inflation kicked off, whereas China is trying to close or at least indicate that they're closing that spigot. So I think they're going in different monetary directions, but I think the result could be very similar insofar as, once again, it threatens to derail the export-based economy, which is the real engine of both of these economies.
Mm-hmm. And sort of broadly speaking here, I mean, China certainly has major economic issues that it needs to address in order to move forward, but at the same time, growth of 7.5%, comparatively speaking, isn't necessarily all that bad. I mean, if you compare China's growth, for example, to the economies in Europe. What's your reaction in that sense?
Well, I think we have to take the Chinese GDP growth numbers with a hefty grain of salt because the current Chinese premier, Li Keqiang, back in 2010, there were leaked diplomatic cables from 2007 that came out indicating that Li Keqiang had said behind closed doors that the Chinese numbers, the GDP numbers, were, quote, man-made and, quote, unreliable. So that's coming from the man who is right now the premier of China and is supposedly the one who's spearheading these attempts to get the Chinese economy back on track. So we have to basically cock an eyebrow up at that idea that there is 7.5% GDP growth right now. I think that that's an artificially constructed number. But certainly China has performed better in recent years than a lot of the economies, for example, in Europe. But that is coming to an end, and I think that we could see this really a spiral out of control if the Bank of China isn't very careful about what it's doing. Because once again, if they do send out the wrong signals, or if they do tighten that liquidity too much, too quickly, it could have some devastating effects that, as you say, will spill around the world. This is really an economic loaded gun that's pointed at the head of the Chinese economy, and they're staring down the barrel of that gun right now. And it seems to be a rock and a hard place. There isn't a lot of wiggle room for maneuvers here.
All right, a rock and a hard place indeed. Unfortunately, we're out of time, sir. That was James Corbett of the Corbett Report website. Thank you.